Beloved, I want you to know this from the very beginning, and I want you to let it settle slowly, not as information but as recognition. Some of the most important moments of your life never looked like victory. They didn't arrive with applause or relief or the clarity you expected. They didn't come wrapped in certainty. They were quiet, confusing, and easy to overlook. They didn't announce themselves as turning points. They felt ordinary, almost invisible, as if nothing had happened at all. And yet, in the unseen world, they landed with incredible force. They struck something deep. They echoed far beyond the moment itself. You have already lived through a moment like that. You didn't plan it. You didn't wake up that day knowing that history would shift because of you. You may not have realized its weight at the time, because the soul often moves before the mind understands. Still, that moment sent a tremor through places you couldn't see. Something ancient shifted. Something old and entrenched loosened its grip. A door that had been sealed for generations opened, not with violence, not with spectacle, but with authority. The kind of authority that doesn't need to prove itself. It didn't happen because you were loud. It didn't happen because you were dramatic or spiritual sounding or impressive to others. It happened because you chose differently. In a moment where instinct told you to react, you paused. In a moment where history told you to repeat, you refused. You answered pain without passing it on. You felt the familiar pull to become hardened, defensive, sharp, and instead you stayed soft without becoming weak. You broke away from patterns that once defined your bloodline, patterns so normalized that no one questioned them anymore. You had the courage to walk away from what felt familiar, even when your past tried to call you back home with familiar voices, familiar emotions, familiar justifications. That single decision rearranged more than you know. It reached further than your own relief. It moved through timelines. Many people believe that change requires bold displays, dramatic declarations, or visible transformation. But heaven responds to alignment, not noise. Heaven responds to truth, lived quietly, not performances staged for approval. As Scripture says, the Lord looks at the heart, not the outward appearance. 1 Samuel 16:7. When your heart chose truth, healing began its work beneath the surface, before anything else could catch up. There was a moment when you chose truth quietly, bravely, maybe even with shaking hands. You didn't feel strong. You didn't feel victorious. You felt exposed. You felt unsure. There was no spotlight, no announcement, no validation. Yet that single choice carried a power far greater than it appeared. It was so aligned with what was real and good that it broke spiritual agreements you were never meant to hold. Agreements you didn't sign consciously, but inherited through silence, fear, and survival. Letting go of them didn't feel dramatic. It felt like choosing not to betray yourself one more time. Let me speak to you personally now, not as a concept, but as someone who sees the cost of what you carried. You were never designed to live under constant emotional pressure buried in guilt, shame, or silent self-punishment. That weight you thought was discipline was not discipline at all. That inner voice that kept you small was not wisdom. That relentless self-criticism was not humility. It was a generational lie passed down and disguised as responsibility, strength, or morality. It survived because no one questioned it. And the moment you stopped agreeing with it, even if you didn't have the words, even if it was only a subtle inner refusal, it lost its authority. The contract ended right there. You didn't just begin healing, you disarmed something that had influenced your family line for a long time, something that thrived on silence and compliance, something that counted on exhaustion, on to keep going. But here's what matters next, and this is where many people hesitate. What breaks on the inside has to be fully claimed there before it shows up on the outside. You must recognize that something truly changed, even if your environment hasn't caught up yet. That what once ruled you no longer has permission to stay, even if it still tries to knock. There are patterns that have existed for so long they start to feel inevitable. They start to feel like fate, like personality, like just the way things are. Sometimes even heaven allows them to continue, not as punishment, but because no one has interrupted them yet. An interruption doesn't come through perfection. It doesn't come through striving or proving or fixing yourself. It comes through purity of heart. It comes through honesty. It comes through a willingness to stop pretending that what hurts you is helping you. That's what you brought into that moment. Maybe it looked like nothing more than a pause, a deep breath, a decision to choose love instead of ego, restraint instead of retaliation. self-respect instead of begging, integrity instead of control. Most people never noticed. They went on with their day. They didn't mark the moment. But God did. Heaven saw you stop when you could have reacted. Heaven heard the prayer you whispered when bitterness was an option. Heaven watched you walk away without needing the last word, the explanation, or the victory you once thought you needed. That quiet obedience shifted the system around you, because sometimes a long-standing pattern has to reset when one person refuses to follow the script. Scripture says, "Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it?" Isaiah 43:19. New things rarely announce themselves loudly. They emerge subtly, often while you're still grieving what you thought you needed. God responds to alignment, not appearances. That one soul-level decision rearranged what was coming next. Not because you forced it, not because you earned it, but because you were ready. Ready for more than just getting through the day. Ready for spiritual authority that doesn't dominate but stabilizes. Ready not only to be free yourself, but to become a doorway for others without even trying to be. You thought you were just surviving a storm. You thought you were barely holding it together. In truth, you were changing the weather for those who will come after you. You were altering the emotional climate of a lineage. This kind of divine shift doesn't just bring relief. It expands access. It creates room where there was none before. It loosens ceilings that others learn to live under. There are spiritual rhythms and generational echoes that repeat until someone chooses differently. They repeat through marriages, through parenting styles, through unspoken expectations and inherited fears. And you did choose differently. When heaven recognized it, trust was released. Not favoritism, not special treatment, but confidence. Confidence that you could be entrusted with freedom and not misuse it. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Galatians 5:1. You weren't chosen because you were better. You weren't chosen because you were flawless or strong or spiritually impressive. You were chosen because you were available, because you stayed present instead of numbing out, because you refused to let pain turn you into someone you're not, because you stayed open when shutting down would have been easier and safer, because you didn't harden your heart to survive. You held the line without applause, and heaven kept record when no one else did. Now the systems that once slowed you down are loosening. The patterns that once pulled you backward are losing their grip. They're searching for somewhere else to land, somewhere familiar, somewhere willing. But they cannot land on you anymore. You're no longer under them. You've risen above them, not in pride, but in clarity. And the moment you chose, not to repeat what came before, something ancient finally broke. Let this settle gently in your heart, not as pressure, but as permission. The things your parents apologized for but never fully healed. The wounds your grandparents learned to live with and quietly called normal. The emotional climates they adapted to because survival required it. The unspoken patterns you sensed long before you had language for them. All of it was waiting for one moment, one person, one quiet decision that said, without shouting, without blaming, without needing permission, it stops here. You didn't announce it. You didn't argue your case. You didn't demand recognition. You said it with your life, with restraint, with boundaries, with the choice to not become what hurt you. You stepped away from what was familiar and into a covenant that had been waiting for someone willing to walk differently, even without a map. And now you're here, in a season that feels unfamiliar. Not because you're lost, but because no one before you showed you how to stand on this ground. You're learning without models. You're building without templates. You're trusting without guarantees. You're walking into spaces your ancestors could only imagine, spaces they hoped for but didn't know how to reach. The surprising thing is how quiet it feels. No fireworks, no drama, no constant emotional spikes. Just a deep stillness, like breathing freely for the first time and realizing you had been holding your breath for years. This is what it feels like when a spiritual system breaks, when something releases its hold and the nervous system slowly begins to realize that it is no longer under threat. When your thoughts start to settle into places they've never been allowed to rest. When your choices no longer come from fear of repeating the past, but from a growing sense of inner permission. When the old alarms don't ring as loudly anymore. When silence stops feeling dangerous and starts feeling spacious. When your soul recognizes that the ground beneath you is different now, that the rules have changed, that the expectations you once lived under no longer define the edges of your life, that there is room to respond instead of react, to listen instead of defend, to move forward without dragging every old story behind you. And as you stand there, noticing the unfamiliar calm, noticing how your body responds to it, noticing how your spirit begins to stretch into it. There is an awareness slowly forming, not as a declaration but as a knowing, that this quiet is not emptiness, that this stillness is not absence, that what has opened does not rush, does not demand, does not explain itself, but waits, present, steady, and patient, allowing you to learn how to live without the weight that once defined every step, allowing new instincts to form where old reflexes once ruled, allowing you to discover who you are, when survival is no longer the loudest voice guiding your choices, allowing the unfamiliar to become trustworthy as you remain here, breathing, listening, noticing, adjusting, standing in a space that did not exist before you chose differently, a space that continues to unfold as you stay with it, moment by moment, without needing to name the destination, without needing to rush toward an ending, without needing to resolve everything at once, as the shift continues to move through layers you are only beginning to sense, touching places that have waited a very long time to be reached, responding to your presence, your willingness, your steadiness. As you remain right here, you weren't chosen because you were better than anyone else, and this is important to understand deeply, because misunderstanding this can quietly turn freedom into pressure. You weren't chosen because you were stronger, smarter, more spiritual, or more disciplined. You weren't chosen because you had everything figured out, or because you never doubted. You were chosen because you were available. Available enu, GH, to stay present when everything inside you wanted to escape. Available enough to feel what hurt instead of numbing it away. Available enough to listen when truth knocked softly, instead of drowning it out with noise, busyness, or distraction. You stayed present when dissociation would have felt safer. You stayed awake when shutting down would have been easier. You refused to let pain reshape you into someone hardened, cruel, or disconnected. You refused to let disappointment become your personality. You refused to let bitterness become your protection. You chose to remain yourself in situations that tried to train you to disappear, adapt, or perform just to survive. That availability is rare. Heaven recognizes it immediately. You held the line without applause. There was no crowd to cheer you on. There were no affirmations echoing back your worth. In many moments there was only silence, misunderstanding, or the quiet sense that no one really saw how hard it was. And still, you stayed true. Heaven kept record when no one else did, not as a tally of suffering but as witness to integrity. There is a kind of faithfulness that only exists when no one is watching, and it carries a weight that visible obedience never will. Now the systems that once slowed you down are loosening. You may not see them collapse all at once. Often they unravel gradually, like old ropes fraying strand by strand. The patterns that once pulled you backward are losing their grip. They no longer feel as convincing. They no longer feel inevitable. They may still attempt to assert themselves, still whisper familiar arguments, still try to lure you into old reactions. But something fundamental has changed. They are searching for somewhere else to land, somewhere that still agrees with them, somewhere that will carry them forward. But they cannot land on you anymore. You are no longer under them. You are no longer defined by them. You have risen above them, not by force, not by denial, not by pretending they never existed, but by refusing to keep feeding them with unconscious agreement. And the moment you chose not to repeat what came before, something ancient finally broke, something that had outlived its purpose, something that had mistaken longevity for authority. Let this settle gently in your heart. Don't rush past it. Don't minimize it. Don't turn it into another expectation you have to live up to. Let it rest there as truth. The things your parents apologized for but never fully healed, the emotional patterns they named but didn't know how to change, the cycles they recognized but felt powerless to interrupt, the wounds your grandparents learned to live with and quietly called normal because survival demanded it, the coping mechanisms that were passed down as personality traits, the silences that became traditions, the fears that were treated as wisdom, the unspoken patterns you sensed long before you had language for them were real. You weren't imagining them. You weren't overly sensitive. You weren't dramatic. You were perceptive. Your nervous system recognized what your environment normalized. Your spirit noticed what words avoided. All of it was waiting for one moment, one person, one quiet decision that said, without aggression and without apology, "It stops here." You didn't announce it. You didn't make a speech. You didn't demand that anyone else understand. You didn't argue your case or collect evidence to justify your choice. You said it with your life. You said it with restraint when you could have escalated. You said it with boundaries when you could have overextended. You said it with the choice to not become what hurt you, even when becoming it would have given you power, protection, or control. You stepped away from what was familiar and into a covenant that had been waiting for someone willing to walk differently. Not faster, not louder, just differently. You didn't inherit a map for this terrain. You didn't have examples that showed you how to do this cleanly or easily. You learned as you went, through trial and error, through listening, through recalibration. And now you find yourself standing in a season that feels unfamiliar. This unfamiliarity does not mean you are lost. It means you are early. It means you are standing on ground no one before you stood on long enough to describe. You are learning what freedom feels like without chaos. You are learning what peace feels like without waiting for it to be taken away. You are learning how to trust calm without scanning for danger. That learning takes time. It takes gentleness. It takes patience with yourself. You are walking into spaces your ancestors could only imagine. Spaces they dreamed of in quiet moments but didn't know how to reach. Spaces they hoped their children or grandchildren might one day inhabit. You are carrying answers they never received, not as explanations but as embodied change. And the surprising thing is how quiet it feels. No fireworks, no dramatic emotional highs, no constant sense of urgency, just a deep stillness, like breathing freely for the first time and realizing how long your body had been bracing. This is what it feels like when a spiritual system breaks. It doesn't always feel explosive. Often it feels spacious. Often it feels subtle. Often it feels like your reactions slow down before your circumstances do. It feels like noticing you have options where you once felt trapped. It feels like recognizing your own voice without it being drowned out by inherited fear. It feels like your nervous system slowly learning that it no longer has to stay on high alert. When a system breaks, it doesn't just affect behavior, it affects perception. You begin to see situations with more nuance. You begin to respond instead of react. You begin to feel emotions without being overtaken by them. You begin to recognize where you end and others begin. Old triggers lose their sharpness. Old accusations lose their power. Old roles lose their grip. You start to inhabit your life instead of enduring it. This is not the absence of struggle. It is the absence of unnecessary suffering. It is the difference between pain that teaches and pain that traps. It is the difference between discipline that refines and shame that erodes. As you stand here, something in you is reorganizing. Your instincts are recalibrating. Your sense of self is rooting more deeply. You may notice that some relationships feel different now. Some dynamics may resist the change. Systems rarely release control without protest. But you are no longer obligated to manage their discomfort by shrinking yourself. There will be moments when the unfamiliar still feels lonely, when you wish someone had walked this path before you and left clear instructions, when you wonder if you are doing it right. In those moments, remember that clarity often follows courage, not the other way around. You are learning by living. You are becoming by choosing. You are not late. You are not behind. You are not missing something essential. You are exactly where interruption turns into integration. As time passes, you will begin to notice the fruit of what shifted. It will show up in how you speak to yourself, in how you handle conflict, in how you rest without guilt, in how you allow joy without bracing for loss. It will show up in the people who feel safe around you without knowing why. It will show up in the questions others ask you when they sense something different but can't name it. You are becoming a living interruption. Not by preaching, not by persuading, but by embodying another way of being. And this embodiment is quiet, but it is powerful. It does not rush. It does not force. It does not need constant affirmation. It simply exists, stable and present, inviting others to notice what is possible. So as you move forward, do not rush to define this season. Let it teach you. Let it stretch you. Let it become familiar at its own pace. Trust that what broke did so for a reason. Trust that what opened will continue to unfold. You do not have to return to who you were to honor where you came from. You honor it by going where they could not. Stand here without apology. Walk forward without fear. Carry what has been entrusted to you with humility, not pressure. You are not responsible for fixing everything. You are responsible for staying aligned. That alignment is enough. It always was.